You came back. Good. Pull up a chair and try not to make a sound. This is the last whisper. Hey, before you keep scrolling, I need you to hear something. A soldier went into a bombed-out school to help clean it up. Standard mission, nothing unusual. But when he got to the basement, he found a letter. And what that letter described wasn't just sad. It was one of the most disturbing things any human being has ever put into writing. Because the man who wrote it, he had no idea he was already living inside a nightmare. He thought he was going to work every day. He thought people were smiling at him in the hallways. He thought the school was clean, the food was fresh, and everything was going to be okay. None of it was real. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you're going to question what's keeping you sane right now, and whether you'd even know if it was gone. There's a certain kind of horror that doesn't come with monsters. No jump scares, no supernatural creatures crawling out of the dark. Just a man, a quiet man, and the complete, silent collapse of his mind. So gradual, so total, that he never once noticed it happening. What makes that terrifying isn't the violence of it, it's the peace. The absolute, unshakable peace of a man who had lost everything and found a way to feel nothing about it at all. This story starts with a teacher, a middle school history teacher who had been doing her job for 17 years. Every spring, she'd collect what she called living history projects. Kids sitting down with elderly relatives, recording memories. Most years, it was exactly as dull as it sounds. But one spring, a quiet, unremarkable girl in her class, call her Olivia, handed in something different, 2 discs, and what was on them would keep that teacher awake at night for a very long time. The first disc was a video, grainy footage, a cluttered, overstuffed living room, the kind of place where decades of accumulated junk had completely swallowed the furniture. Olivia was curled up in an armchair, small and tense, holding a notebook. Across from her sat her great uncle, a gaunt, weathered man named Stephen, a cigarette in one hand, an expression on his face like someone who had been carrying something heavy for a very, very long time. Stephen had served in the mill, Literi. He'd been stationed in Eastern Europe after a civil war had torn through a region of the Balkans, sent in as part of a reconstruction effort. Not combat, just cleanup, just rebuilding. The kind of duty that sounds routine until you understand what cleaning up after a war actually means. Because war doesn't end when the shooting stops. It leaves behind something that takes years to process. Rubble where houses used to be, empty storefronts with the windows still blown out, streets where the only things moving are stray dogs and people who have nowhere else to go. Stephen had seen all of that. He'd walked through cities that looked like they'd been chewed up and spat out. He thought, by the time his unit reached that school, that he was prepared for whatever he might find. He was wrong. His unit was assigned to a school. The building had been demolished by the violence, caved-in ceilings, shattered windows, debris everywhere. What disturbed Stephen most wasn't the destruction itself. It was the fact that no one had touched it. For years, the school had sat exactly like that, gutted and hollow, while children walked past it every single day on their way to beg in the streets. Nobody boarded the windows. Nobody cleared the rubble. Nobody put up a fence or a warning sign. The community had simply looked away from it, the way you look away from something too painful to acknowledge. When Stephen's unit entered the building for the first time, the smell hit them before anything else. Every soldier on that assignment knew what that smell meant. They'd encountered it before. They moved through the ground floor carefully, systematically, cataloging the damage, assessing what needed to be done. Standard procedure, routine. Then Stephen went down into the basement. And that's where he found the letter. It was sealed in a plastic sleeve, placed deliberately on the ground just outside a basement door. The door itself was barricaded shut from the inside, a chair wedged firmly under the handle. The smell was stronger there, much stronger. Stephen stood in that hallway for a moment, looking at the sealed letter on the ground, and he understood immediately what he was about to deal with. He had a fellow soldier translate the letter for him before they opened the door. He needed to know what it said first. And decades later, sitting across from his teenage great-niece in that cluttered living room, he read it out loud. The letter was written by a man named Stanislav. Stanislav was the school's janitor. He described himself as someone who had never cared much about politics, never took sides in the war, never wanted anything more than a quiet, ordinary life. He lived in a small house just 1 field away from the school, close enough that he could see it from his window. He walked to work every morning. He knew every inch of that building, every sticky patch on the hallway floor, every desk that wobbled, every window frame that swelled in the rain and needed to be forced open. That school was, in every practical sense, his entire world. He had a wife named Nadja, a baby girl named Ludmila, and then, slowly, illness took them both. Stanislav wrote about it with a kind of devastating restraint, the way someone writes about something they've turned over in their mind so many times that the sharp edges have worn smooth. He described watching his baby daughter fade quickly. He used the word mercifully. Then he described watching Nadja suffer for much longer. He tried to get her to a hospital, but the journey was too far, too difficult. He brought her home. She died that night. After they were gone, Stanislav simply stopped. He stopped going to work. He stopped leaving the house. He stopped eating regular meals. He lay in the dark and thought about ending his life over and over, but couldn't find the energy to act on it. The grief wasn't dramatic. It wasn't screaming or breaking things. It was the opposite, a total, suffocating stillness. The only thing that broke through it was a radio. He never turned it off. The clearest signal he could get happened to be broadcasting in English, a language Stanislav didn't speak. He had no idea what was being said, but the voices, the simple, constant presence of human voices, kept something in him from going completely dark. He carried the radio with him everywhere. He slept with it on. He woke up to it every morning. It became less like an appliance and more like a lifeline, a companion, the one proof he had that the world was still turning somewhere beyond the walls of his grief. And then, one day, he decided to go back to work. He didn't make a big decision out of it, didn't mark the date, just woke up one morning, picked up his radio, walked across the field, and went back to the school. Picked up his broom, started cleaning. He wrote about that return with something close to contentment. He described how no one made a fuss about him coming back, how people just smiled at him in the hallways and got on with their day. He described the satisfaction of mopping floors, fixing broken furniture, feeling like a functioning piece of a larger machine again. He wrote about moving things out of the way so he could get every inch of the floor clean, taking pride in that. He described the food storage area behind the building, full of preserved goods, and how he eventually began sleeping in the basement so he wouldn't have to leave the school unguarded overnight. He wrote about it with genuine warmth, real gratitude, the writing of a man who had found his footing again after the worst period of his life. Every single word of it was the account of a man in the grip of a total psychotic break. And this is the part that changes everything. When Stephen's unit first arrived at that school, it had been a ruin for over 2 years. The Civil War had destroyed it 2 full years before any soldier ever set foot inside. There had been no teachers in those hallways, no students, no functioning kitchen, no larder full of fresh preserved food, no repaired desks, no clean floors. The letter Stanislav wrote had a date on it. It was dated 2 weeks before Stephen arrived. 2 weeks before soldiers showed up to begin reconstruction, Stanislav was still inside that building. And based on everything he'd written, the routines, the repairs, the meals, the sleeping arrangements, he had been inside it for close to 2 years. Let that settle for a moment. For nearly 2 years, Stanislav had been walking into a bombed-out shell of a building every single morning and going to work. He had been sweeping floors buried under rubble and dried blood, believing they were coming clean. He had been nodding to people in the hallways, smiling at them, receiving their smiles in return. But those people were dead. The bodies left behind by the war. Stanislav had been carefully moving corpses aside to mop the ground underneath them, the same way you'd move a chair or a stack of books. He had been eating food from a larder that soldiers later described as almost entirely rotted and moldy, and had apparently tasted none of it. He had been sleeping in the basement of a collapsed building through rain and cold and God knows what else, and his body had simply adapted because his mind had decided none of it was real. The mind is not a passive thing. When reality becomes too catastrophic to process, it doesn't just shut down, it builds. It constructs. It manufactures a version of the world that the person inside it can survive. Stanislav's grief had been so total, so annihilating, that his mind had essentially rebooted, and what it booted up into was the last thing he remembered feeling okay in. The school, the routine, the familiar weight of a mop handle, and the quiet satisfaction of a clean floor. And the radio was the engine that kept the whole thing running. As long as those voices were talking, as long as that thin, constant stream of sound was filling the silence, the constructed world held together. The radio was the proof that something existed, that Stanislav existed within it, that the smiling faces in the hallway were real, that the food was fine, that the floors were clean, that everything was going to be okay. The morning he wrote the letter, he woke up to silence. The radio had died. And what happened next, as Stanislav described it, wasn't a dramatic unraveling. It was quieter and more terrible than that. He spent the entire day trying to fix it, examining it, adjusting it, doing everything he could think of. And as the hours passed and the silence continued, something began to come back. Not all at once, but in pieces. The way a fog lifts slowly off a landscape, first revealing one shape, then another, until suddenly you can see everything and wish you couldn't. He cried. He panicked. He felt 2 years of suppressed grief pressing against the inside of his chest like something trying to break through a wall. He gave himself until sundown, a deadline. If he could fix the radio by then, he would keep going. If he couldn't, he wouldn't. The sun went down. He wrote the letter, carefully, with the kind of deliberate calm that only comes when a decision has already been made and all that's left is the paperwork. He placed the radio and the letter outside the basement door, leaving them for whoever might come looking, and then he went inside. He wedged the chair under the handle, and then he kept the promise he'd made to himself. When Stephen and his unit reached that basement door, everything was exactly as Stanislav had described. The letter in its plastic sleeve, the radio sitting beside it on the ground, the chair visible in the gap at the bottom of the door, the smell. Stephen said that when they finally opened the door, the sight inside was one he never fully recovered from. Not because of the brutality of it, he had seen far worse in his time, but because of the strange, impossible stillness of the man hanging there. Stanislav hadn't been dead long enough to deteriorate significantly. His face was blue, his eyes were open and bulging, but his posture, his expression, Stephen struggled to describe it. He said Stanislav looked less like a man who had died in anguish and more like a man who had simply finished what he was doing and stopped. The basement around him told a different story. In the corners were the remnants of 2 years of improvised survival, evidence of meals eaten in the dark, of repairs attempted on broken infrastructure, of a man maintaining a routine in conditions no living person should have been able to maintain. The floor near the door, Stephen noted, was cleaner than the rest. Stanislav had been moved, pipping it. And the radio was still there, exactly where he had left it, sitting on the floor outside the door. And it was still on. Nobody could explain it. The most likely answer is something mechanical, a loose connection that had temporarily broken and then reseated itself, a battery that had drained and then found just enough residual charge to start transmitting again. These things happen. There's probably a completely mundane explanation. But what Stephen couldn't stop thinking about, what he described to Olivia in that living room decades later, what Olivia quietly recorded on her phone because she knew the story needed to be heard, was the timing. The radio came back on after Stanislav was already gone. After the decision had been made, the door had been barricaded, and there was no longer any way for him to hear it. The voices came back, too late, still talking to him, still keeping him company in that dark, cold basement, just like they had been doing for 2 years. Olivia cried through most of what her great-uncle told her. And when the teacher who received that school project sat alone listening to the recording, she cried too. Not just because of the horror of it, but because of Stanislav himself. Because he was not a monster or a cautionary tale. He was a man who had loved his wife and his daughter, a man who had found dignity and purpose in an ordinary, unglamorous life. A job. A man whose mind had done the only thing it knew how to do when faced with unbearable loss. It protected him. Completely, totally, at enormous cost. Here's what makes this story reach into something deeper than ordinary fear. Stanislav never knew he was broken. Not for a single day of those 2 years did he wake up feeling like something was wrong. He woke up with purpose. He had a job to do, people who appreciated him, a routine that gave his days structure and his life meaning. His internal world was entirely consistent, entirely coherent, entirely convincing. There was no moment of doubt, no crack in the surface. The delusion was not a symptom he could feel. It was the ground he was standing on. He was living inside a ghost story. He just didn't know he was the ghost. The school wasn't keeping him alive. The delusion was. And when the radio died and the delusion cracked, when reality came flooding back in through 2 years of silence, Stanislav looked at what was actually around him, understood what it meant, and made his choice. He chose the world he had built over the one he had woken up to. And honestly, given what he woke up to, given the rubble, the bodies, the mold, the cold, the 2 years of absolute solitude, it's hard to call that choice incomprehensible. That's the part that doesn't let go, not the body, not the blue face or the open eyes or the smell in that basement. The part that doesn't let go is the radio coming back on after he was already gone, still playing, still talking, still doing the only thing it had ever done for him, which was fill the silence so completely that the world felt survivable. The mind builds walls to keep the unbearable out. Most of us have them. We don't call them delusions. We call them routines, habits, distractions, coping mechanisms. We call them the things we can't imagine living without. The music we put on when the apartment gets too quiet. The podcast we run in the background so we're never alone with our own thoughts. The small, consistent rituals that stitch our days together and make the world feel like it has shape and order. Stanislav had his radio, and the question that his story leaves behind, the one that stays with you long after the details have faded, is this. How much of the world you believe in right now is real, and how much of it is just the sound of a voice in the dark telling you everything is fine, because without it, you'd finally have to look at what's actually around you. The radio kept playing after he was gone. Maybe it's still playing now.